Ever had high hopes for a game sequel, only to be crushed like a Goomba under Mario's boot? Get ready to cringe as we dive into the dumpster fire of the worst video game sequels ever created. Subscribe to the channel and let's take a joyride through gaming's Hall of Shame. Devil May Cry 2 isn't just a poor entry into the DMC series, it's one of the worst action games on the PS2. It's baffling how it passed quality control. Can you imagine the excitement after the groundbreaking first game? The original set a new standard for the action game genre. Unfortunately, the sequel turned out to be a complete disaster. Everything about it felt off. It's hard to fathom what the original developers were thinking. Creating this game after the first feels like stepping into a completely different universe, with nothing aligning with its predecessor. You could easily mistake this for one of the many forgettable PS2 action games. The combat is shockingly sluggish and clunky, making every attack feel awkward. Enemies mostly stand around waiting to be defeated. The bosses are equally disappointing. They are easily defeated using the devil trigger, making battles feel trivial. Any reasonable person would have compared it to the first DMC and said, "No way, we can't release this." The Fear games were once graphical powerhouses. The original game's lighting and physics engine remain impressive even today, which cannot be said for Fear 3. The environments are muddy, the guns look small and unremarkable, and the sound effects are flat. The entire game has a B-grade feel to it. It's immediately evident that the series was handed off to less skilled developers. Instead of Monolith Productions, known for their technical prowess, Fear 3 was developed by Day One Studios, and the results are underwhelming. The guns in the original game felt powerful and satisfying to use, but in this installment they feel like pea shooters. The new co-op mechanic, where player 2 is a ghost who can possess enemies, is somewhat interesting, but it's the only notable feature in the game, and not particularly enjoyable. The campaign is also very short and overall mediocre at best. The first Lords of Shadow game was divisive, but as a God of War clone, it stood out with a satisfying campaign and a plethora of fun boss fights. There was certainly room for improvement, and a sequel could have been truly great. However, the sequel took a bizarre turn, set mostly in a cyberpunk future where you play as Dracula, battling the literal spawns of Satan. Yes, the devil is the antagonist in this game, and the demonic imagery feels really out of place. Setting the game in a fantastical cyberpunk future is just one of the many odd choices they made. There's also a heavy emphasis on stealth, where you, as Dracula, the king of vampires, have to sneak around and avoid unkillable cyber demons. It's not just that the game includes stealth, it's that the stealth mechanics are poorly executed. If you're going to introduce something completely new to the series, it has to be good. That said, the combat is somewhat refined compared to the original game, and the large Metroidvania-like map is a nice touch. However, there are just too many issues with the game to overlook. It's disappointing because there was real potential here if they had simply built upon what worked in the first game. Instead, they veered off in a completely different and problematic direction. Nobody had particularly high hopes for Duke Nukem Forever when it finally released in 2011. The game had been a punchline for years, mired in mismanagement and missed deadlines. Despite low expectations, it still managed to disappoint. That's how bad this game is. Unlike Duke Nukem 3D, which you can revisit as a genre piece, a good boomer shooter. Duke Nukem Forever fails to capture that essence. The game is plagued by boring, narrow corridors, and initially you could only carry 2 guns, expanded to 4 later. Whenever you get shot, the screen is smeared with red jelly. This was a dark time for FPS games, and Duke Nukem Forever amalgamated all the worst aspects of contemporary console shooters into a disappointing mess. It's boring, unfunny, and most crucially, the shooting mechanics are weak. It's a poorly made game that ultimately put an end to Duke Nukem for good. Back in the PlayStation 1 era, the original Driver was incredibly popular, standing as direct competition to Rockstar. However, with Driver 3, they aimed for greatness but ended up with a colossal failure. Calling Driver 3 a disaster is an understatement. It is a complete mess. The game is so buggy that it's practically unplayable, with super unresponsive and awkward controls. Visually, it looks terrible because it is terrible. It's disappointing because the Driver series had a unique appeal. Instead of sticking to its strengths, the publisher tried to chase the success of Grand Theft Auto, resulting in this debacle. Driver 3 is a massive letdown and a blemish on what could have been a great franchise. Deus Ex: Human Revolution marked a triumph return for the series, serving as a true successor in ways that Invisible War never did. While we could easily include Invisible War on this list due to its various shortcomings, Mankind Divided is far more disappointing. All the elements were there for it to be the next great Deus Ex game. For starters, Mankind Divided looks fantastic and boasts some of the best environmental design in the series. The concept is compelling, focusing on the brewing resentment between augmented and non-augmented people. Though the themes of prejudice can be a bit heavy-handed, the foundation for a good story is there. However, the game feels incomplete, like half a game. Unlike other Deus Ex titles, which feature multiple hub areas and lengthy campaigns, Mankind Divided is short, with only one hub and an abrupt cliffhanger ending. Almost nothing in the main plot is resolved, and the primary antagonist feels more like a starter villain than the main event. The whole experience feels unfinished in a deeply disappointing way. Even if the plot is eventually followed up on, it doesn't excuse how short and inconclusive this game felt. The original Mercenaries on the Xbox was one of the best open-world games of all time. It featured the innovative Deck of 52 system, where you hunted down the most wanted members of a North Korean regime. You could call in airstrikes, artillery, and pilot a variety of vehicles. It was a fantastic game, albeit somewhat archaic by today's standards. Mercenaries 2 should have built upon everything that made the first game great, but it fell short. For one thing, the game was extremely buggy upon release to the point of being nearly unplayable. Many of the gameplay systems from the first game were toned down and scaled back, making elements like artillery less fun and more cumbersome to use. The game was also disappointingly short for an open-world title, a significant step down from the original satisfying campaign. The Deck of 52 system was entirely cut, leaving much less to do. Although the addition of co-op multiplayer was a notable improvement, it was one of the few positives. In every other way, Mercenaries 2 was a lesser game and a real disappointment as a sequel.